Okay, we're going to have a little look and start at our construction. So I'm going to start with the base. So I have my exterior base panel and I have my super stiff interfacing, which I've already fused to the wrong side of my base panel. I've made my markings, so the markings are 1 inch in from either side and then 2 inches in from the curved ends to create my rectangle. And I've made my holes on the corners of the rectangle. Now, bag feet. I'm going to use a basic bag foot. You can buy bag feet in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and this is just a standard domed bag foot. And bag feet are usually supplied with the foot and a washer. I also have some screw-in ones that are a bit like a Chicago screw, so you have a screw that fits into the back, but I'm going to use these today. And I just need my duct tape because that's the other thing that you'll need for bag feet. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to pop my bag foot through from the front, from the right side to the wrong side. And most bag feet will have one stem that is slightly longer than the other. So if you use your fingernail and just split them apart slightly, you don't need them wide apart at this point, just slightly apart. Pop your washer on and push it down. You'll find that the two stems push outwards. Now I like to have them so that they go top to bottom, those two stems. If you have them going out to the side, sometimes depending on where your bag feet are, they shouldn't impede on your stitching in this instance, but some bag feet have really long stems on them. And just pop them through and that will secure them. Now, if you don't have washers come with your bag feet, and this does sometimes happen, I've had them arrive without any washers to go on the back, you can use a little tiny piece, a little square of this plastic mesh stuff, which we often use for bag bases, and use that as a washer instead. Just cut a little square and use 2 of the holes to push the stems through. If you haven't got that, you can use a little bit of plastic cutting mat, the flexible chopping board that we use, as a washer, and just again 2 little slots to put the legs through. So I'm going to pop all 4 of my bag feet in, and again I'm just going to open that up slightly. I don't know about you, but I never seem to have quite enough washers. And I've had bag feet arrive without any washers. If you're in America, you often call them purse feet, because in America, you call a bag a purse. It's a very strange thing. Given that we all speak the same language, we call these things different things. So, number 2, number 3, and number 4. Don't make your holes for your bag feet too big. You don't want them to rattle around at the bottom of your bag. You want them to feel nice and secure. And this is only optional. If you don't want to put bag feet on, then you don't have to. I just think it helps to protect the bottom of your bag. And we do tend to put our bags down all over the place, which picks up germs and all sorts of nasties. So I think having bag feet just protects the base. And that one's a bit tighter to get apart. So there we are, 4 bag feet installed. And now, just for a little bit of extra safety and also to protect the inside of your bag. On this instance, it doesn't really matter so much because we are going to put foam over the top, but just a little tiny bit of duct tape popped over the top protects the inside of your bag, because if you're not going to put foam over the top, and some people don't, if you don't want to use foam in this, you don't have to. It will give you a much slouchier bag though. But with a lot of other bags that don't have additional foam over the top, these bits can be quite sharp and will sometimes make cut marks in your lining, and you don't really want the hardware to cut holes in your lining. So popping a little bit of duct tape over the top just gives a little bit of added security to the feet, and also covers any sharp edges that there might be. So that's our bag feet installed, and don't they look super? And I'm just using a plain silver domed bag foot, nothing fancy. Now I'm going to take my foam and just get a couple of clips to hold that in place. So I'm putting my foam over the top of my stiff stabiliser. And yes, this is faux leather, not fabric. The same will apply if you're using fabric for your base. However, I usually, if I'm using fabric for my base, I would usually put a little drop of fray check around the holes that I've made for the bag feet, just to be on the safe side, because they do sometimes twist a little bit and that will cause fraying. So I've now attached my foam, clipped my foam onto the wrong side of my base, and I'm just going to sew baste all the way around the outside. And when I say sew baste, I mean stitching at the longest stitch length that I have at about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, so well within the seam allowance. And it just holds the foam in place. Just swivel you along a little bit so you can see what I'm doing. Let's put a light on, shall we? Whoa, look at that. It's not very bright here this morning. So my machine, the longest stitch I have on my machine is a 6, and a lot of machines don't have a stitch as long as that. You don't need to back stitch at the beginning or the end, because you will be removing these stitches later on. This is just to secure your foam into place. So now my foam is fully attached to the wrong side of my faux leather. Now when you baste your foam, sometimes where it squishes it down flat, you get a little bit of extra foam that kind of squishes around the outside. Remove that, because when you come to line things up, it's easy to find yourself lining up with the edge of the foam and not the edge of the faux leather, which will not help you when you fit this base. It needs to be fitted exactly. So that's my foam attached to my faux leather for my base. I'm going to pop that out of the way. Now, this is my back panel, my front panel I'll show you in a second. If you're doing a fabric version and you're doing the overlay, what you need to do is take your overlay and lay it so that the bottom edge of the overlay matches the long edge at the bottom of your exterior panel. This is a rectangle, so either side could be your bottom edge, it doesn't matter. Lay it so that the overlay sits along the bottom edge of your exterior panel. Clip along the bottom and the sides to make sure that it's perfectly level, and then top stitch along the top edge of your overlay. I like to top stitch at 1/8 of an inch. I usually do 2 layers, the 2 lines of top stitching. Usually the first one's at 1/4 of an inch and then the second one's at 1/8 of an inch. I find it easier to do my second line, the closer line, second, because it's already kind of attached at that point. Now, if you're worried about your machine going through layers of thickness, once you've added that overlay, you can actually lift the overlay and cut away the exterior fabric from underneath. It's personal preference. My machine will go through it either way, but not everybody's machine will. So that's if you're going to put the overlay on, now is the time to do it, and do that on the front and the back. If you're using an overlay on the front and the back, you can choose to do one just on the front if you want to, with the weave on it, or you could choose not to put an overlay altogether and just do the whole thing in fabric. So having added your overlay, which I'm not going to do because this one's not having an overlay because this one is all in faux leather, you need to line up your exterior fabrics with your foam, and we're going to sew baste along the top and the bottom, not the shorter sides. So I'm just going to sew baste that again, whoops a daisy, at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance along the bottom edge and the top edge. And this is just to secure the foam in place. Now, I always used sew-in foam. I don't like fusible foam. I find that it puckers up and creases, and I just generally can't get on with it. If you're somebody that prefers fusible foam, by all means use it. If you've got fusible foam and you don't want to use it as fusible foam, if it's single-sided, what you can do is fuse a layer of cheap polycotton or even a muslin will do to the fusible side before you start sewing, which will then give you sewing foam, because it basically gets rid of the fusible part. And again, you can see here along the edge where I've sewn, my foam has just splayed out just a fraction, so it's just slightly bigger. It's only a little tiny bit, but I want to make sure that my foam sits exactly the same size as my exterior panels, so that when I come to line them up, I'm actually lining up the sides of the exterior fabric and not the sides of the foam. So that's my back panel done. And this is my front panel. Now I'm using Styleville, which is a Viling product. It's about 5mm thick, and it gives excellent stability, standy-uppiness, whatever you want to call it, to the bag. I have made one with headliner, 3mm headliner, and it's perfectly adequate on a faux leather bag, as long as your faux leather isn't too soft and squishy. I haven't made one with fusible fleece, however, I know one of my testers did. She made her bag from cork, and used a good quality cork, I might add, and used fusible fleece instead of foam because that was her preference, and her bag looks fabulous. So if you're not a foam fan, or if you think your machine won't manage the layers of foam, you can use fusible fleece. It will, however, give you a slightly less structured finished bag. I would say though, if you're using fabric for your exterior, you probably will need to have some sort of foam, because I think it will probably just collapse if you just use fabric. Unless you're using a decor weight fabric, which has got some structure to it. So you kind of have to play it by ear and understand your fabrics to be able to change up the interfacings. So just make sure that all of the foam is behind the exterior panels and not sort of sitting out from the sides. Just gives you perfectly clean edges. It's only a fraction that I'm taking off to be able to join things together. So there we go, that's my front and my back basted to my foam. Now I'm going to lay those two panels right sides together, and very carefully I'm going to match the sides of the exterior fabric. And if you've cut your foam so that it's actually properly on the edges, that should be nice and level. I'm going to do the same on both sides, making sure that the top corners match. Oh, need more clips. And the bottom corners match. You need everything to be really even and really level. There we go. And I'm going to reduce my stitch length down to just less than 3, and I'm going to stitch down both sides using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that's 10 millimeters for those of you that are metric. Just doing a couple of back stitches at the beginning, and you must stick really carefully to the seam allowance, because if you don't, the bottom won't fit when you go to fit it. I'm sewing on a Juki TL98P sewing machine. It's a straight stitch only machine. I'm using Coats Moon thread. And a size 16 Schmetz universal needle. I always use Schmetz universal needles for sewing with faux leather. I know different people have different preferences, and a lot of people, I see it often where people say, oh, you use a leather needle. If it's one piece of advice I can give you, it's do not use a leather needle. Leather needles have a cutting blade along the edge of the needle to be able to cut through leather. Leather is effectively a natural product, and it's skin and it's fibrous. So punching holes makes punching holes with a normal needle through leather can cause the fibres to kind of explode out. So leather needles are designed to cut through rather than punch through leather, because it is a fibrous natural material. Faux leather, however, is not fibrous. It's not a natural material. It's plastic, effectively. It may well be a flexible plastic, but nonetheless it's plastic. So if you use a leather needle, you'll be cutting holes into your faux leather that will be bigger than your needle. When you're sewing leather, the leather will heal around those holes and heal back, so it closes up around the holes. If you use a leather needle on faux leather, it will not heal around those holes, and you'll end up with much bigger holes than you need, which will eventually cause your stitch line to perforate, because you'll effectively be making a perforated line of holes that are far bigger than you need. So for faux leather, I would always use a universal needle. I know some people like to use a top stitch or a denim needle. I don't use either. I feel that that's completely unnecessary and causes far bigger holes than you need. It is a personal preference thing, and I don't think there are any hard and fast rules with regard to what needle to use. This is what I use. So I've now stitched down both sides, and I'm now going to trim away all the foam from the seam allowance. And I do this really carefully because I don't want any bulk in the seam allowance. So you can see when I trim away the foam, I have my scissors flat to the foam, which gives a nice mitered edge on the edge of the foam within the seam allowance. I'm going to do the same on the other side. And at this end, Oh, this is one of my least favourite jobs, is removing foam from the seam allowances, but it makes a huge difference to the finished bag, so it's worth doing. And believe me, if there's a stage that you can skip, I'll have found it, because I do like to miss out what I consider to be unnecessary steps, but this is not one of them. Once I've gone through with my big scissors, I'll go back with a pair of smaller scissors and trim off any extra, and it's only a fraction, but it just makes a difference. Now, this is quite a stiff faux leather that I'm using. I'd say it's probably a medium weight. It's an upholstery grade faux leather, not marine vinyl. I find marine vinyl doesn't work particularly well for oval bottoms because it's so stiff it doesn't bend around the bottom. So you've been warned. Right, I think, yep, okay, I'm happy with that. Now, what you need to remember is which is the top and which is the bottom of your bag, and that will depend on what design you've used. And for this one, it makes no odds because I've centered the design. Now, what we do need to do, and what I haven't done, is, let me grab a pen or a pencil, is make a mark that is halfway across the bottom. So it's 6 3/4 in from one side. 6 3/4 in, because this is 13.5 wide. And the same on the other side. I should have done that first, but I didn't. Let's get rid of those. And then the same on your base panel. And the easiest way to do it is to and then on the short ends, it'll be 2 inches in from the side because this is 4 inches. 4 inches wide. Let me just make sure it's 4 inches. Yes, it is. So I've made marks, my quarter marks. So I've got a mark on the short end and a mark either side on the long sides. And we're going to use those to fit the base of our bag. Now I'm just going to grab some more clips because I'm going to need a lot more clips here. All sorts of bits and pieces coming out of my clip pot. So with your base, we're going to fit it right sides together with the exterior of our bag, making sure that you're putting the base at what is the bottom of your bag. So we're going to match up the centre marks on the long side of the base with the centre marks on the body of the bag. And I'm going to do the same on both sides. And what I tend to do is clip out from that point. Once I've got the centre marks lined up, I will then clip out, matching the sides. And this is why it's important that you take away any of that foam that might have been overhanging. I'm going to go along both sides. I'm going to do the same on the other side. So I'm trying to do this so that you can see what I'm up to. So I'm kind of doing it back to front for me, but so that you can see how I'm matching up. Right, so that's the long sides done, and now we need to match this seam on the exterior. I'm going to open that seam allowance with the mark on the end of our base. I'm going to have to move this around a little bit so that I can actually get to it. So I'm just going to clip those two together, and you can see I'm just clipping with the seam allowance open. And once I've clipped that, you'll find that the ends there should just kind of slot in almost. And you just kind of make sure that all those edges are nicely matched and together. And you'll notice that the base sits in slightly where you've put that stiff interfacing inside. So you kind of get almost a ridge around the outside. And again, I'm trying to do this back to front, which is not really very helpful for me. But you need to ease those curves in so that you don't get any wrinkles, because if you get any wrinkles, the wrinkles will show on the outside. And none of us want wrinkles, do we, ladies? With being in lockdown, the likelihood of getting any wrinkles are fairly slim because I'm eating myself out of house and home. So all my wrinkles have been pushed out with body fat, I think. No need for Botox here. So I've got one end in, and you can see that's lots of clips. There's no minimum amount of clips that you can use, as many clips as you feel you need. And I'm going to do exactly the same on the other end. So I'm going to open up the seam allowance with my fingers, match it up to the mark on the base, and clip, and then ease those curves in. And sometimes it just takes a little bit of wiggling to ease those curves in. You do not want any puckers or wrinkles. Now, for some people who find that they don't particularly like doing this with clips, and fitting an oval base is a skill that takes a bit of getting your head round, because you do have to take it really patiently, and you do have to use an awful lot of clips. A lot of people like to use a domestic stapler. Now, I don't even know if I've got my stapler here. I don't think I have. Nope. But they'll literally go round within the seam allowance and put staples in, which just kind of helps to hold things in place. And you can trim those staples out after you've stitched. So if you're going to use staples, which is fine, make sure you do them within the seam allowance. Now, the seam allowance for the base here is 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. It's a 3/8 of an inch. So let's just grab a couple more clips, because I think I may need a couple more. But what you'll find, certainly so much on the ends, is that the base will kind of bend in. Well, I don't know if you can actually see that. Where the stiff interfacing is in the bottom here between the foam and the exterior fabric. But you can see plenty clips. And take your time. If you don't feel that it's matched up perfectly, take all the clips out and start again. It's better to do it 3 times and get it right than rush it. Believe me, you'll thank me for it later. And then we are going to stitch around the base at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now, if you're somebody that's not sure about 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, before you fit your base, you can always draw a line that's 3/8 of an inch in from the edge on the base, so you know exactly where you're going to be stitching. I don't tend to do that because I don't feel like I need it, but it's another sort of hint or tip that for those of you that are not sure about if you can actually stick to a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now, because the base is in the way, it's probably quite difficult for you to see what I'm doing, but I've still got my fairly small stitch length, about 2 3/4, I guess, and I'm going to start on one of the long edges, because the long edges are the easy bit to do. Just do a back stitch to start to secure my stitching. You're going slowly. You shouldn't be going over the stiff interfacing. The stiff interfacing should be within this side of the stitching. And I'm just taking off one clip at a time as I go, as I get to it. When you get to the curve, go nice and slowly. And you will have to kind of pull your bag so that you can get round the curve and manipulate it. Now, if you've used a thicker foam like Stylebill or Bianni's or one of the flex foam foams, it's a little stiffer to get round, but it's doable. So manipulate your bag so that you can get round the curve. Take it slowly. It's really important that this bit's done properly. And there's no easy or quick fix for this. You kind of just have to try and make sure that that seam allowance on the outside stays open. And if it's come adrift, as mine has, you can just open it up with a stiletto, or as I'm using, a pair of scissors, just to keep it open. It just reduces the thickness and stops the end of your curve looking slightly rougher when you turn your bag. And my light's now in the way. And you can see where the bag is now sort of starting to turn round as we come round to the other side of that end curve. Now, I know a lot of people are scared about manipulating their bag, but if you're using a good quality foam stabiliser, your bag will come back. So even if you squash it well out of shape, it will be fine. It will come back. The long sides are the easy bit. It's the curves that are the bit that people generally have an issue with. And again, I'm back to this curve, so I'm just going to take off one clip at a time. And again, it's manipulating your bag so that you can get round that curve. Try and keep that seam allowance open on the side to reduce the bulk. It's difficult because actually the bag stops you seeing what I'm doing. I'm trying to flatten it so that you can see what I'm doing as well. It's actually just making it more difficult for myself, really, to be honest. Until we get back to where you started. A couple of back stitches to secure your stitching. Then you're going to need your seam ripper, because now you're going to remove all of those basting stitches. So all of the basting stitches from the exterior fabrics and all of the basting stitches from the base as well. So you've got 2 rows of basting. And say normally I don't baste very much if I can help it, but in this instance this really does make a difference, so it's worth doing to make sure that you get a decent finish. This is probably one of the most tedious jobs there is. So having removed all the basting stitches, you can now remove all the foam from the seam allowance. And I find this bit easier to do with smaller scissors because it's round the curves, and I just find the bigger scissors don't go around the curves so easily. Try and remove the foam from the open side seams as well. Don't think I've removed my basting stitches there. Now, if you're somebody that doesn't particularly like a very stiff bottom on your bag, you could leave out the super stiff interfacing if you wanted to. I like it, just gives a really firm, stable bottom. We all like a nice firm bottom. I love a nice firm bottom. Sadly, my firm bottom was many years past. I'm more of a wobbler girl now. Oh, on a roll. I think those are very sharp, so I think I may have to resort to my bigger scissors. I just find it easier to get around the curves with the smaller ones. Oh, it's a chore, isn't it? Okay, but before you go any further, just turn your bag right side out and check the base of your bag is sitting nicely. Now bear in mind we haven't done any clipping or anything like that onto our base, but we want to make sure we haven't got any puckers. And so that's what we're checking for at this point. So push your base out. And it will sit better once it's been clipped, but we just need to make sure at this point that we don't have any puckering around the outside. And my base is sitting quite nicely, so I'm quite happy with that. Don't have any puckers. Everything's looking hunky-dory. So I'm going to turn it back through the other way. It's worth checking before you start notching and things if you're going to end up having to put more stitching in. You don't want to try and be doing that after you've added notches. Right, now to help this sit nicely, what we're going to do is we're going to, within the seam allowance, cut little tiny triangles out around those curves. Be careful you don't cut into your stitching. And I have sometimes, and do sometimes, use a notcher for this. I've got a notcher which is designed for making notches on dressmaking patterns, which, given that I don't do dressmaking, it's never been used for its actual purpose, but it does actually work quite well for trimming out the curves like this. If you've got pinking shears, you can use a pair of pinking shears to do this. I have a pair of pinking shears, but they're not very sharp, so it's easier to do with a pair of scissors. I've still got some foam there that needs to come out. And you can just kind of keep trimming out the foam. Just do your little triangles all the way around your curves. You can see there that I've just literally cut triangles all around that side of the curve, and I'll stop when I get to that sort of straight edge. And I'm going to do that on all of those curves all the way around. And I am just going to trim off the very bottom of the seam where I have those two extra layers, because I think that just helps to reduce the bulk there. So I'm just going to carry on. Ooh, still got more foam to come out. This is why I like the little scissors, because the big ones don't cut it properly, not on the curves. You can kind of work away at this until you've got rid of all that foam from the seam allowance, until your base is sitting nicely. Now, if you turned your bag and you've got a pucker, it's well worth removing that little bit of stitching and reclipping and easing the curves in until you've got no puckers in your stitching. Remember though, the more you stitch on faux leather, the weaker it becomes, and stitch holes in faux leather do not disappear. You can use a hairdryer on it and give it a bit of a rub with some warm air, and it will reduce the sight of them, but it depends what faux leather you're using. Some faux leather marks easier than others, and it's better to try and get it right first time round. So I still think that the lots and lots of clips is the way forwards, and taking it nice and slowly. As I say, if you feel that you're not very good at keeping to a seam allowance, then you can mark your 3/8 of an inch seam allowance on the base, so that when you're stitching, you've actually got a line to give you a guide where you're actually stitching. If you've got a really wide foot on your machine, you may find it easier to do with a zipper foot, because this is quite a tight curve that you're going round. Oop. And the same will apply if you're making your bag from faux leather, cork or fabric. There aren't many places where this construction is different for faux leather than it is for fabric, apart from the top zipper panel, and I'll show you both options then when we get to that part, but we're not there yet. Cutting the triangles is my most fun job, and if there was any way of getting around it I would, but it does make a difference to the way the base will sit. Again, I'm just trimming off the very ends of that seam just to reduce the bulk. Still got a little bit of foam that needs to come out. And taking out every bit of foam from that seam allowance will make your base sit so much nicer. So it's really worth making the effort, not being impatient, and getting rid of all of the foam from the seam allowance. Even if that means keep going at it, taking a little bit off at a time until it's all gone. Right, I'm quite happy with that. So I'm now going to turn my bag through, and you can see my seam allowances on the side are still open. So I'm just turning the bag through again. It's always worth inspecting at every stage to make sure things are going the way you want them to and things look tidy, because if you get much further on and things don't look tidy, then you've got a lot of unpicking to do to get back to where you want to be. So I'm just going to roll the edges of the base and the sides in my fingers just to give them a nice corner, a nice sharp finish. And there we go, one perfectly fitted oval base. My bag stands nicely, and that's the main part of your exterior construction done. We'll come back and we'll have a look at how we make and fit our side strap connectors, and we'll carry on from there. See, wasn't as difficult as you thought, was it? Anybody that's wondering about this faux leather, it's basically the cream foam leather that I'm using for the exterior, and I've used Sharpie pens and given it a coat of Oda coat afterwards. So I used Sharpie pens. I did exactly the same for my weave strips, which for this weave, which are multicoloured, I just coloured in strips of faux leather and then did a coat of Oda coat to seal it. I wasn't sure how this would work, but I actually put them through the washing machine, or put a couple through the washing machine to make sure that it actually stayed put, and it does. The only thing that will move that now is if you were to put something like methylated spirits or nail varnish remover on them, that will dissolve the colour pigment. However, I don't plan on putting nail varnish remover on the bottom of my bag, so I think I'm probably fairly safe. And there we go. So base done, feet fitted. Job's a good one. So I'll be back to you to show you how to make the strap connectors.